Okay, paragraph 739. God wanted to become man and still wants to. Now, in this sense, we're talking about the God image. And so this archetype keeps playing through. So there's the vision of the second birth via Sophia. There had been the original production of Adam and then of Christ and so on, and all the virgin feminine. But this is the essence of the individuation process. In other words, this archetype is trying to play through you. And I separately did a video on the individuation process in a Q&A. So I would urge you to go take a look at that. But just to give a quick sense of individuation for others who haven't yet heard that term, individuation is like an oak tree. Every oak tree knows how to become an oak tree. And it will have certain characteristics that are only oak tree. But every oak tree is also different. And so there are programs playing in every oak tree that make that oak tree slightly different than every other oak tree. And the same is true of every other creature. And it's also true of us. And so those programs Dr. Jung called archetypes, but we can call them programs or records that get started. Somebody hits the jukebox and we get an archetype that's constellated, and then we have to play it through. Whether the obvious ones are mother and warrior, and I certainly felt the warrior archetype in me throughout my Marine Corps career, and to the extent that I'm a retired Marine and still carrying my commission, it's not done playing yet. But fortunately, I'm old enough that I probably would not be called back, but technically and legally I could be. But anyway, that program that is playing through, the most basic one is this God image, the self, and realizing the self is the essence of the individuation process. I hope that's a quick thumbnail sketch. So we need the mediation of the opposites seen in John's unconscious. The Christian view between man is the opposites are between man and God, but man always ends up on the dark side in that. And the fear of Yahweh was too great at the time of John for man to consider the antinomy of God himself. Job had not yet been interpreted in Dr. Jung's way, and I think even in contemporary times, most Christians avoid the book of Job and the book of Revelation. It's just too much for most people to absorb, and so most of the Christians I've ever known don't know much about the book of Job or the book of Revelation. And so anyway, the creature is always in opposition to the creator, and so if it's God versus man. And so Dr. Jung's point is that God is trying to come through in the form of this playing through this individuation process. And if we don't recognize the antinomy in the God image, that is, the good and evil within God himself, then we end up with the cosmic and demonic grandeur and evil imputed to man. Okay, so in 740 now, the unconscious wants both to divide and to unite. God acts out of the unconscious of man. Man is forced to harmonize opposing influences. Striving for unity, man can rely on the metaphysical advocate, as Job recognized. Job wants to become man, but not quite. Or God wants to become man, but not quite. He must deal with God's dark side, and that's the expiatory self-sacrifice. In other words, when we go through individuation, it is quite painful to recognize that the evil side is there, and it is in us as well as in the metaphysical God, as Job was pointing out. Now let's see. Stephen Baker says, how does one prepare to wrestle the angel, and are all conscious gestures from the logos? Well, the answer to the second question is no. All conscious gestures are in the ego, and the question is, what have you constellated in your ego? And how do you prepare to wrestle with the angel? Well, studying Dr. Jung is a good start, because it is understanding that each of us must wrestle with the good and evil within ourselves. It's very painful, but it is a process that's necessary. And one of the key points that Dr. Jung made was that men and women are basically moral. We were already moral before Moses came down from the mountain with the tablets. And that morality has evolved over time, and it does evolve over time, and it's evolving in each of us. Each one of us experiences this development of morality within ourselves, and we're in our politics in the United States, we're being faced with that right now, because many of the assumptions that almost all of us had made over our lifetimes about what our country is have been trampled in the last 2 years. And so we have to make our own judgments about whether that's right or wrong, and whether we want to continue that. And these are not processes that get resolved in 2 years or 4 years. They're processes that get resolved in centuries. And the best thing we have is our ability to be consciously aware of it. And there's a video on the channel about the 3 levels of consciousness, which refers to the 3 levels of consciousness in Buddhism. And just to give you a thumbnail of that, the first level is like a child, which is karma, which is what goes around comes around, and the law of cause and effect. And a lot of us never get past that level of maturity, where we have to be faced with the law of cause and effect. The next level of consciousness, as Buddhists refer to it, is the level where you recognize duality, and you recognize that your ideas about that duality may be illusion, but regardless, you have to figure out how to live in the world that has that duality. And then the third level is a level that allows you to come above duality, and to, in effect, see duality from the sky. So whether you're a red state person or a blue state person or a red person or a blue person in our politics, this third level of consciousness would be to rise above it and to recognize that if we continue on with the neurosis that we currently have in our politics, then, we actually have a country that's mentally ill. And so we have to figure out how to unite, and that's a feminine function, an eros function. So we've divided everything up in the logos sort of way in discernment, as Dr. Jung said at the end of Woman in Europe there. But then the eros function needs to come in and unite, and we need to find a way to unite our country so that we can, when I was on active duty in the Marine Corps, I never once thought about whether any of my fellow Marines were from a red state or a blue state or a purple state or any other such thing. They were all Americans to me, and I never considered their race or anything else. All Marines are green. And so that's the kind of thinking that we need to resolve our national neurosis. And so all Americans, I guess, are red, white, and blue or something like that. So Freaky Bro says that's the best distillation of idea individuation I've yet heard, and thank you. And Stephen says the book of Job and the book of Revelation are the only bits of the Bible that still interest me. That's good, because those are the ones that are still alive, and we're wrestling with that angel today, no doubt. Okay, moving along here. Got about 33 minutes available. Okay, so God incarnated his good side to create the most durable basis for a later assimilation of the dark side. So what Dr. Jung's interpretation is that, okay, humanity was living in this instinctual way before the time of Christ, or before, let's say, the millennium before the time of Christ. And God, or the God image, allows God to be all good, so that some of the ideas of this goodness and logos and rationality could be introduced into humanity. Obviously, it came in other religions as well. It's not that other religions are not moral. They're all, humanity has been developing across the species, and so this is the promise of the Paraclete too, the Holy Ghost, where God becomes man, and it's the testimony to the continuing incarnation. And what Dr. Jung is saying is that God is alone in his Godhead, and that is not in a state of bliss. He must be born in the human soul, and Christ is the prototype for that development, at least of the God image. We're not talking about metaphysical God here. And so paragraph 742, all manner of good and evil can break through in us, particularly love. Sheer will for destruction is in John, as in John is not expected, but cases of severe, they only come up in cases of severe psychosis and criminal insanity. So what Dr. Jung is saying is that most people don't have apocalyptic dreams and visions like this. And he observed in his career that they came up sometimes in psychosis and criminal insanity, but not otherwise. And what he said is that we have a considerable mixture of darkness in us, and all we have to do is watch cable news every night to see it. And so our darkness mitigates the evil forces, but more vulnerable and less able to resist. So we're vulnerable because we don't realize that it's actually a part of God that's doing that, and it's we, in terms of the continuing incarnation, that need to make the moral decisions. And so we need more light, goodness, and moral strength, and also wisdom. And so those are the things that are being proposed at the end of Revelation. And interestingly, I'll just pull out Revelation and the epilogue to Revelation, because I think there are a couple of interesting facts here. One is that we're almost at the end of the Bible now. In Revelation 22, 11 and 12, and the Bible ends at verse 21, but at 11 and 12, we basically have a definition of karma, almost exactly as it is described in Buddhism. So this is John of Patmos now speaking, but relaying his vision. Let the wicked still act wickedly, and the filthy still be filthy. The righteous must still do right, and the holy still be holy. Behold, I am coming soon. I bring with me the recompense. I will give to each according to his deeds. And so I am the Alpha, and then 13, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. And, in my personal experience, karma does work perfectly. Any time that I feel that I've been wronged by someone, I never feel a need to act out my vengeance, because what I've often found is that the other individual has their comeuppance, and it's all often pretty nasty without me doing anything. And whether that's God or just someone else that they've wronged, that's a different issue, but it always works, and so it's not necessary to be vengeful. And then what's the other one? And so then he's describing who are blessed. Blessed are they who wash their robes so as to have the right to the tree of life and enter the city through its gates. Outside are the dogs, the sorcerers, the unchaste, the murderers, the idol worshippers, and all who love and practice deceit. And so, and then verse 16, I, Jesus, sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, the bright morning star. So anyway, the point is that there's always going to be evil people, and it's we that have to make a decision about who's right and who's wrong. So in medieval times, a senior churchman or leader would have been respected and followed. Christ's quote, except ye become as little children. The point about this quote is that in children, the opposites are close together, and there's a totality that transcends consciousness. And what Jung says is that Christ hinted at a morality of evil. And so, there obviously are different perspectives on practically everything that happens. And and so we have to make our own judgment about what's right. So paragraph 743. The child in the apocalyptic vision is but caught up to God. So that means it's for the future. And so we're talking about 2,000 years ago now. So this child is the divine revelation that, the Holy Ghost is coming forth in humanity, the human continuing incarnation. And so anyway, there were the issue for that time, for John of Patmos's time, was the issue wasn't the opposites. The issue was people were living much more instinctually, and therefore rationality needed to come, and hope for a better world needed to come, and that's what the Christian eon has presented. And so but now we have to recognize that the evil part of God, the dark side, has to be brought into us. I mean, even Star Wars, turned out that James Earl Jones was Luke Skywalker's father, and so there's some of that in each one of us, and so we're at the closing of the revelation. Revelation is the hieros gamos, the marriage, and this is classic individuation, and it starts to be come through in the form of the Assumption of Mary by Pope Pius XII. At the time of Revelation, the issue was not uniting the opposites, but rather incarnation of light and good, and so that's why it happened the way it happened. And so paragraph 744, the Assumption of Mary is the fulfillment of John's vision. It's justified as the Sun Woman that John saw on Patmos, and his references to the marriage of the Lamb and the Old Testament reference to Sophia. So these are all archetypal things that have been repeating. In paragraph 745, everything now depends on man, immense power of destruction, and we need the help of an advocate in heaven. The image of the goal of life spontaneously produced by the unconscious. It's a dynamic process of instinct. And so one of the key points here is that this God image, whatever you want to call it, the archetype of the self, is going to play out no matter what we do. And whether a man accepts the responsibility for what he is doing or proposes to do. And this brings up the parable of the unjust steward, which is Luke 6:4, where Jesus comes upon a man who's working on the Sabbath, and he says, "Man, if you know what you're doing, you are blessed, but if you don't know what you're doing, you are cursed and a violator of the law." And so the point is that we all have to know what we're doing, and if we're mature enough to know what we're doing and to make the moral decisions, then we're blessed. But if we're not mature enough, then we better follow the laws that have been put down. And so his point is that the unconscious is always struggling for the light, but it fights against it as well. God wants to become man, but not quite. And so Stephen Baker says the Book of Job, book of the Okay, then Miles says, and God is not a Christian, nor is he about exceptionalism. When he says no one comes to God except through me, the deeds are love. Yeah, I find myself somewhat mixed in my reaction to saying it's the God of love. And even Jung, at the end of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, does say that. But there, we have to balance. And so it can't be all love. It's not all eros. We're not all going to run off in the weeds and start having fun with the opposite sex or with our partners. We have to have a balance. Obviously, we need rationality, but we also need life. We need to be alive. And if the rules are making it so that we cannot live, then we've got a problem. Freaky Bro says, definitely seems that the morality of evil ironically becomes a powerful force in more dogmatist, dualistic interpretation of religion, where darkness is externalized and distinguished from God, and light is idolized. I think that's the point that he's making here, that these things are not outside. I mean, evil is not outside. The dark side is not outside. It's in us. Now we get up to this section where I had this numinous experience, and I'm just going to tell you about it, and you can look the video up. It's called, and I wish you would watch that video to see this numinous experience that I had. It is called Synchronous and Numinous Event is Integrated with Meaning, Caught on Video. And what I'm talking about is in the middle of paragraph 746 comes this sentence: something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. It is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. Okay, so that is the very first sentence that you will hear in that video. And so it's empirically demonstrable. And then you see how my conscious mind takes what occurs during this video, starting at 2 minutes and 9 seconds into the video, and interprets it. The task of the conscious mind to understand the hints. So if it does not happen, individuation continues, but is dragged by fate toward the inescapable goal, which might have been reached walking upright. And so what Dr. Jung is saying is, you are going to individuate one way or another, but if you know what's happening to you, you're going to at least be able to go upright instead of getting dragged. Then his quote, the only thing that really matters now is whether man can climb up to a higher moral level, to a higher plane of consciousness, in order to be equal to the superhuman powers which the fallen angels have played into his hand. And it's the role of the average man filled with sin, not one who's held aloof and isn't playing a part in life. And it's right at that moment in the video, and in order to be equal to the superhuman powers which the fallen angels have fallen into his hands, right at that moment that 4 F-18s flew over my home on their way to fly over the football game at the U.S. Naval Academy. And there's no human being that could have planned that event. It happened exactly at that moment. And the very next words that I was reading in paragraph 747, since the apocalypse, and the apocalypse here he's talking about is World War II, we have almost a godlike power. So here's this godlike power coming in exactly between those two sentences. And then I discuss at 4 minutes and 55 seconds into it where I stop my reading, and you see it start to work on me in a numinous way. And so if you ever want to see an example of something that's numinous, I can't imagine anything more numinous than that. I mean, even if I had the power to plan it with the powers that be of the U.S. Navy, it would have been impossible to execute properly. And I'm sure you'll agree. And so, again, something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. It is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. And so that's the hint, as I was hit over the head with that one. And so now we have 12 more minutes to get through Dr. Edinger's comments here. And one of the things that he is talking about is that we have to fear God and give his glory, give him glory. And so John's revelation predicts our trials, the trials that we've had in the 20th and 21st centuries. And he's talking about the pleroma, which would be his version of heaven, is the sea of grace is with the seething lake of fire, and the image comes up like this because the seething lake of fire is the upward pointing triangle, and the sea of grace is the downward pointing triangle, and also the upward pointing triangle is the masculine, and the downward pointing triangle is the feminine, of course. And so he actually has an image of that in here, which I should have made for you, but I didn't have time. So let me just make sure you can see it. So you can see that he's talking about sea of grace and L-O. The O is in the middle. I'm having trouble doing this backwards, but the L is in the middle, and then so the upward pointing triangle is the lake of fire, and the sea of grace is the downward pointing, and so you see that it's showing fire and water, and it becomes Solomon's seal, right? Okay. So anyway, that's what we're faced with. And he says, if you want to know what the lake of fire is, all you have to do is exhale until you can't do it anymore. And it's right there in your physiology. That's what the lake of fire is. And so anxiety, what he's saying is that anxiety is expression of the proximity of God. And you're shifting your understanding from the personal to the transpersonal. Once you get it, you get it. Okay, I mean, once you understand what is personal and what is transpersonal and what is God, or the God image, then you know. Okay, so then he's talking about the whore of Babylon is the dark secular city. Babylon was Baghdad, and the Jews went through the Babylonian captivity partially because of David's infidelity with Bathsheba and his indirect murder of Uriah, at least so the story goes. But the counterpart of this secular city, the whore of Babylon, is the heavenly Jerusalem, which is heavenly, spiritual, and divine. And he refers us to Psalm 137, which I didn't get a time to look up, so if I can find it quickly, I will see if I can read it for you. Here's, okay, Psalm. So Psalm 137 is called Sorrow and Hope in Exile. And it says, by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat weeping when we remembered Zion. And Zion is Jerusalem in this case. On the poplars in its midst, we hung up our harps. For there our captors asked us for the words of a song. Our tormentors, for joy, sing for us a song of Zion. But how could we sing a song of the Lord in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget. May my tongue stick to my palate if I do not remember you, if I do not exalt Jerusalem beyond all my delights. Remember, Lord, against Edom that day at Jerusalem. They said, level it down to its foundations. Desolate daughter Babylon, you shall be destroyed. Blessed the one who pays you back what you have done us. Blessed the one who seizes your children and smashes them against the rock. Well, you know, that's all well and good, but I think we can grow up a little bit beyond that today. And so Augustine talked about the city of God, the earthly city, which is the city of flesh, and the spiritual city, which is the spiritual city of God. And at the end of Revelation, we have the New Jerusalem coming out of the heavens. Well, that might be happening in our psyche, but it's not happening in the physical world. So psychologically, Dr. Edinger is saying the earthly city is the ego, the heavenly city is the self from a psychological point of view. And there be a total accounting. That's what this Revelation verses I read earlier are. Revelation 22, 11 and 12. You do not get away with anything. You know, karma is going to get you. That's the Christian and Buddhist version of what goes around comes around. And he makes a reference to the big book in dreams. Sometimes there's a big book in dreams, and that represents the final accounting. And it's the relation of the individual ego to the self. And he says, there are such things as damned souls. The more consciousness insists on its own luminous nature and lays claim to moral authority, the more the self will appear as something dark and menacing. That's Dr. Jung's quote. Something dark in dreams, the self is not happy. John's visions are collective and archetypal forms, not personal. If they were personal, he might have been a psychotic, but they're interpreting them as collective. And the next point he makes is that the personal could be included, but they don't think so in the case of John of Patmos. And it's a premonition of a tremendous enantiodromia that has occurred. We've observed it now, and Dr. Jung at the time of his death felt that we were right in the middle of it and felt that we could have a thermonuclear war. We're still not out of the woods, but hopefully we have wise leaders who will keep us out of that. So the symptom of anxiety is a manifestation of the proximity of God. The opposites reside in the God image. The paradoxical God tears one asunder with the opposites. The prescription is to wait for the uniting symbol. In other words, if you're having anxiety, the uniting symbol will emerge in dreams and visions. God wants to become man, but not quite. And so, finally here, archetypal dreams are examples of the fallen angels passing on this divine knowledge to the ego, and it is important that the ego pick up on what is being passed on to it and not turn away. And so I would once again refer back to my experience with the numinous and synchronous event, which I've given you the link to. Just take a look at that and see the divine knowledge as it was passed on to me, in my view. Okay, and so that's my unconscious reacting to that event, which only happened to me. Nobody else saw it, and except over 400 people have seen it on video now, but at the time, no one else saw it or knew about it. Only I knew about it. It's not unique to me. Okay, all of us have religious experiences. The question is whether you recognize them or not. Okay. Freaky Bro says serendipity and synchronicity really is bewildering and exciting stuff to be cognizant of the way synchronous numinous experience unfold all around us. Absolutely. And Miles says, yes, indeed, the clarity of Skip giving us the words to see what we sensed is critical. Okay, so my point here is, and I only have one more minute or so here, my point is that we all have these religious experiences. I happen to notice them almost daily. I mean, just the example I gave in this video where I was going to talk about apocalyptic vision today, and by synchronicity, I'm listening to an audio tape of Walter Isaacson's book about Leonardo da Vinci, and I'm hearing about an apocalyptic vision that bothered Leonardo all through his life. And, what are the odds of that happening? That's a perfect example. And so, the issue for anybody that's watching this video is to start noticing these for yourself. And particularly read especially paragraph 746 of this, which contains this sentence. It's about halfway down. Something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. It is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. And so that's what I'm talking about, is these events. And obviously you see how significant I thought that particular example was. Freaky Bro says, yes, between Skip's and Peterson's navigation through Jung's ideas, this ex-atheist can no longer fall back on his rational empiricism. In every case, it's helping open us up to our higher selves. Apocalyptic dreams definitely reoccur for me. And so this is the divine drama, Freaky Bro. This is what Dr. Jung is referring to as the divine drama. And this divine drama lives in all of us. It is archetypal. And let me, if I don't make you too dizzy, I will quickly go back to the beginning here in Dr. Jung's Dr. Jung's points here about the world hangs on a thin thread, and that's the psyche of man. And his point that it's the great mistake is thinking that just the average man, it doesn't mean anything to him, and that's not right, because these all of these archetypes are born into all human beings from the beginning, and they can come up in anyone. And Dr. Jung's point was that we cannot tell the difference between something that happens with the metaphysical God and our own God image, the self. And the self has been proven empirically. Dr. Jung felt that he was a scientist, and he presented his work in a scientific fashion. And so what he was saying here in answer to Job is that these are the things that he can point to from a scientific point of view, and they are in our psyches, and they are in all human psyches, whether they are the primitives of Africa, where he visited out on Mount Elgon, or the primitives of the American Southwest that he visited, or whatever they are. And in every religion, these archetypes appear. And so one of Dr. Edinger's points here then is that Revelation basically predicted the divine child, which is, and that divine child coming in the future, which is understanding that these things are psychological, and they're not just ooh outside of us, they're in us. And so that was the point. Okay, so we are on the cusp of the most controversial chapters, paragraphs in Answer to Job, which I consider to be paragraphs 751 to 754. I personally had an epiphany when I read this, in fact, multiple epiphanies, which I'll talk about next week. But they're extremely powerful paragraphs, and so I urge you to read them, and they will be the topic for next Thursday at 1:30. Hopefully I'll get my sound under better control by then, and I hope you don't have too many apocalyptic dreams in the meantime. I am enjoying doing these teachings. I hope they're useful to someone around the world, and I'm particularly honored that many of you have come back multiple times. That's a good sign. Anyway, peace. Take care.